My name is Father Thomas Brennan, and for the past 7 years I have served as an ordained exorcist within the Vatican's most secretive division. The department has no official name in any registry. Those of us who work within its walls simply call it the shadow ministry. We operate in absolute silence, deployed to cases that ordinary priests cannot handle. Situations where demonic presence has manifested beyond the realm of theological theory and into horrifying, tangible reality. Before I continue, I need you to understand something crucial. What I am about to share with you violates several confidentiality oaths I swore before God and the Holy See. But recent events have convinced me that silence is no longer an option. People need to know what exists beyond the veil of our perceived reality, and more importantly, they need to understand the rules that keep us alive when we confront it. I was recruited into the shadow ministry on a winter evening in Rome, 3 months after completing my doctoral studies in theology at the Pontifical Gregorian University. I had shown particular interest in demonology, not from morbid curiosity, but from a genuine desire to understand the nature of evil and how to combat it. My thesis focused on documented cases of possession throughout church history, analyzing patterns and commonalities that secular psychology could not explain. Cardinal Vasquez approached me in the university library just before closing time. He was an elderly man with deeply lined features and eyes that seemed to hold centuries of terrible knowledge. Without introduction, he placed a manila folder on the table before me and asked a single question. Would I be willing to put my academic theories into practice, knowing that doing so would likely cost me my peace of mind, possibly my sanity, and perhaps even my immortal soul? I remember the weight of that folder in my hands. Inside were photographs and incident reports from a case in Bavaria. A family of 5 had been found dead in their farmhouse, their bodies arranged in a perfect circle around an inverted crucifix carved into the wooden floor. The mother's journal documented 3 months of escalating supernatural activity before the final tragedy. Her entries became increasingly frantic, describing voices that spoke from the walls, shadow figures that watched from corners, and a pervasive smell of sulfur that burned their throats and eyes. The local diocese had sent 2 priests to perform a blessing. Both men disappeared. Their bodies were discovered 6 days later in the farmhouse cellar, positioned in prayer, their eyes and mouths sewn shut with black thread that forensic analysis could not identify. The thread dissolved into ash when removed from the corpses. I accepted Cardinal Vasquez's offer that night. My training began immediately in a facility buried 3 levels beneath Vatican City. The complex exists in architectural blueprints as a document archive, but those dusty records are merely a facade covering reinforced doors that lead to something far more sinister. Down there, beneath centuries of accumulated history and faith, the Church maintains its oldest weapons against darkness. The training lasted 18 months. They taught us the traditional rites of exorcism, of course, but also much older practices drawn from texts that predate Christianity itself. Some of the rituals we learned were written in languages that have not been spoken aloud for thousands of years. My instructors were men and women who had survived decades of spiritual warfare, each bearing scars both visible and invisible. It was during this training that I first learned about the rules. 9 absolute commandments that every exorcist must follow without exception. These are not suggestions or guidelines. They are the difference between returning from a case intact and becoming another cautionary tale whispered in the shadow ministry's halls. Father Alessandro Conti taught us the rules during our 4th week of training. He was 43 years old but looked 60. His hair prematurely white, his hands bearing burn scars from an incident he refused to discuss. He gathered our group of 7 trainees in a circular chamber lit only by candles, and he spoke in a voice rough from too many shouted prayers in too many cursed places. The first rule he gave us was this: never, under any circumstances, engage with a demonic entity alone. Always maintain a minimum of 3 exorcists during active spiritual combat. This is not about courage or faith. Even the strongest priest, armed with complete conviction in divine protection, can be overwhelmed by the psychological and spiritual assault that demons employ. They will find the weakness in your soul, the secret shame you have never confessed, the doubt you hide even from yourself. They will exploit it with surgical precision. Father Conti told us about Father Michael Reeves, a British exorcist who believed his faith was unshakable. He entered a possessed woman's home alone, confident that God's protection was sufficient. The entity inside her spoke to him for 7 hours, slowly dismantling his psychological defenses. It revealed knowledge about Father Reeves that no human should have possessed. Details about his childhood, about moments of weakness, about a crisis of faith he experienced during seminary but never discussed with anyone. By the time backup arrived, Father Reeves had renounced his vows and hanged himself with his own rosary beads. The possessed woman had no memory of the encounter and was successfully exorcised 3 days later by a proper team. But Father Reeves was gone, his faith destroyed so completely that he chose damnation over continuing to exist with what the demon had shown him about himself. The second rule concerns timing. Never begin an exorcism ritual after sunset or before sunrise. Demonic entities draw power from darkness, not metaphorically, but literally. Something about the absence of sunlight strengthens their connection to our physical realm. The Church's Occult Research Division has theories involving electromagnetic fields and circadian disruption of human consciousness. But the practical reality is simple. Exorcisms conducted at night have a 73% higher casualty rate. I witnessed the consequences of violating this rule during my 2nd year of active service. We were called to a monastery in the mountains of Austria, where a young monk had become possessed after discovering a hidden chamber beneath the chapel. The chamber contained artifacts from a Gnostic cult that had occupied the site in the 4th century, before the monastery was built over their temple. The possessed monk was violent and growing stronger. The abbot insisted we begin immediately, though sunset was only 2 hours away. My team leader, Father Dmitry Volkov, argued for waiting until morning, but the abbot feared the monk would hurt himself or others during the night. Against protocol, against the rules, we agreed to attempt a preliminary blessing and restraint, planning to perform the full exorcism at dawn. We entered the monk's cell at 7:43 in the evening. Twilight filtered through the barred window. The young man was strapped to his bed, thrashing with inhuman strength against leather restraints. When he saw us, he smiled, and the temperature in the room dropped so precipitously that our breath misted the air. Father Volkov began the opening prayers of protection. Before he could finish the first verse, the window shattered inward despite no wind or impact. Darkness poured into the room like liquid shadow, extinguishing our candles and plunging us into absolute blackness. In that darkness, things moved. I felt hands that were not hands touching my face, my throat, my chest. I heard voices speaking in languages that hurt to hear, words that made my teeth ache and my eyes water. We barely escaped that cell. Father Volkov suffered a complete psychological breakdown and spent 8 months in a psychiatric facility under church care. He never returned to exorcism work. The possessed monk was found dead the next morning, his body twisted into a shape that human anatomy should not permit. The autopsy revealed that every bone in his body had been broken, but somehow he had remained alive for hours after the damage occurred. The third rule involves names. Never reveal your full baptismal name to a possessed individual. Demons collect names the way some people collect debts. A name, given freely or discovered through their supernatural perception, provides them a spiritual connection to you that persists even after the exorcism is complete. They can use that connection to find you, to haunt your dreams, to gradually wear down your sanity over months or years. All exorcists in the shadow ministry operate under pseudonyms. Thomas Brennan is not my birth name. My real name was sealed in a classified document and locked in a vault beneath St. Peter's Basilica the day I completed training. Only the cardinal prefect knows my true identity. To everyone else, including my fellow exorcists, I have always been Father Thomas Brennan. This precaution seems extreme until you learn about Father Maria Santos. She was one of the most gifted exorcists in shadow ministry history, successfully conducting 43 major exorcisms over a 12-year career. During her 44th case, she made a single mistake. The possessed girl was only 9 years old, and in a moment of compassion, trying to comfort the child within the demon's grasp, Father Santos whispered her real name. The demon heard. 2 weeks after that successful exorcism, Father Santos began experiencing nightmares. She would wake to find symbols carved into her bedroom walls, though she lived alone in a secured Vatican apartment. She heard her name whispered in empty corridors. Objects in her room would rearrange themselves to spell out accusatory messages. The psychological warfare continued for 3 months until Father Santos suffered a catastrophic nervous breakdown during a routine blessing. She attacked the family she was helping, screaming that they were demons in disguise. It took 4 priests to restrain her. She was institutionalized for her own safety and the safety of others. I visited her once, 2 years ago, in the private facility where she resides. She is heavily medicated, but still occasionally lucid. During my visit, she grabbed my hand with surprising strength and begged me to never let them know my real name. She said the demon still visits her in that place, still whispers to her, still shows her things that make her want to tear out her own eyes. The 4th rule requires constant vigilance. Never consume food or drink offered by anyone connected to a possession case. This includes family members, friends, or anyone living in or near the affected location. Demonic entities can influence people without fully possessing them, creating what we call spiritual contamination. These contaminated individuals may not even realize they have been compromised when they attempt to poison or drug investigating priests. The poisons are rarely conventional. Sometimes they are substances that lower psychological defenses, making exorcists more vulnerable to demonic manipulation. Other times, they contain ritual elements that create a sympathetic link between the exorcist and the demon, allowing the entity to directly assault the priest's mind and soul. Father Yuki Tanaka learned this lesson in the most painful way possible. During a case in Kyoto, the mother of a possessed teenage boy offered tea to the exorcism team. It seemed like innocent hospitality, a nervous woman trying to maintain normalcy in impossible circumstances. Father Tanaka accepted a cup to be polite, to establish rapport with the family. The tea contained a mixture of psychoactive compounds and blood from the possessed boy. Within an hour, Father Tanaka began experiencing visual and auditory hallucinations. He saw his deceased parents standing in corners, their faces rotting, accusing him of abandoning them when he entered the priesthood. He heard children crying from inside the walls. His 2 team members had to abort the exorcism and rush him to the nearest shadow ministry medical facility. Father Tanaka survived, but his ability to distinguish reality from demonic illusion was permanently compromised. He can no longer perform exorcisms because he cannot trust his own perceptions. The last I heard, he works in the Vatican archives, far from any field work, still taking medication to manage the lingering effects of that poison tea. The 5th rule is perhaps the most disturbing. If a demon knows information about your life that you have never spoken aloud to anyone, even in confession, do not engage further. Withdraw immediately and report to your superiors. This indicates the demon has accessed knowledge through means we do not fully understand, suggesting either a more powerful entity than initially assessed or a pre-existing connection between the demon and the exorcist. This type of supernatural knowledge breach has only occurred 17 times in shadow ministry history, and 12 of those cases resulted in the exorcist's death or permanent psychological damage. I have experienced this myself. 3 years ago, during a case in Prague, the possessed man looked directly at me and described in perfect detail a recurring nightmare I had experienced as a child, before I ever entered seminary. A nightmare I had never shared with anyone, not my parents, not my therapists, not my confessors. The demon spoke in my own childhood voice, recreating dialogue from that nightmare word for word, describing images that existed only in my sleeping mind from decades ago. I followed protocol. I withdrew from the room immediately, despite the screaming protests from the entity. I filed my report. The case was reassigned to Father Heinrich, a veteran with 30 years of experience. The cardinal prefect personally interviewed me for 6 hours, trying to determine how the demon had accessed that memory. We never found an explanation. Father Heinrich completed the exorcism 2 weeks later, but the incident left me shaken for months. I still wonder how that demon knew. I still wake sometimes, uncertain whether the nightmare is truly mine, or if it was somehow planted by something that wanted to establish a connection with me years before I ever became an exorcist. The uncertainty is almost worse than knowing. The 6th rule addresses a phenomenon we call spiritual echoes. Never return to a location where you have performed an exorcism within 5 years of the completion. Sites of major demonic activity retain traces of that presence, and returning too soon can reactivate dormant spiritual energy or attract new entities drawn to the residual darkness. Exorcism sites are not simply cleaned and forgotten. Each location is documented, blessed repeatedly, and monitored by local church contacts for years afterward. We maintain a classified database of every exorcism performed by shadow ministry, complete with GPS coordinates, dates, entity classifications, and recommended waiting periods before any shadow ministry personnel can safely return. Father Antonio Rossi ignored this rule, and it cost him everything. He had successfully exorcised a particularly violent demon from a farmhouse outside Rome. The family was grateful, the demon was banished, and the case was closed. But Father Rossi felt personally invested in the family's well-being. Against direct orders, he returned to the farmhouse 6 months later to check on them. The moment he crossed the threshold, he felt it. The air was wrong, thicker somehow, harder to breathe. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. And then he heard his own voice calling to him from upstairs, using his real name, the one locked in the Vatican vault. The voice promised him things, terrible things, wonderful things, impossible things. Father Rossi fled the house, but it was too late. Something had attached itself to him during those few minutes inside. Over the following weeks, he began to change. His colleagues noticed personality shifts, sudden outbursts of anger, long periods where he would stare at nothing and whisper in languages he did not speak. The entity was slowly consuming him from within, wearing his skin like a costume. The shadow ministry had no choice. Father Rossi himself was subjected to an exorcism, a procedure that is psychologically devastating even under the best circumstances. The exorcism took 4 days and nearly killed him. He survived, but he is not the same man. He moves like a puppet with half its strings cut, speaks in monotone, and his eyes are completely empty. The church quietly retired him to a monastery where he spends his days in silent prayer, perhaps seeking the pieces of his soul that were torn away during his own possession. The seventh rule is practical but absolute. Always maintain a blessed escape route during an exorcism. Before beginning any ritual, identify at least 2 exits from the room and ensure both have been consecrated with holy water and blessed salt. Mark these exits with sanctified oil in a pattern the demon cannot cross. This provides an emergency evacuation path if the situation becomes uncontrollable. Demonic entities can manipulate physical space in limited ways. Doors that were open suddenly slam shut. Windows seal themselves. Walls seem to shift and change, creating spatial distortions that trap victims inside with the possessed individual. Without prepared escape routes, an exorcism team can find themselves locked in a room with an entity that grows stronger by the minute, feeding on their fear and exhaustion. The disaster in Bucharest illustrated why this rule exists. A 3-person exorcism team entered an apartment to address a case of suspected possession. They were experienced, well-trained, and confident. But they skipped the preliminary blessings, too eager to begin the ritual and return home. They did not consecrate the exits. 20 minutes into the exorcism, every door and window in the apartment sealed shut. Not locked, sealed, as if the wood had grown together into a single solid mass. The team was trapped. The possessed woman stood up from her restraints, which simply fell away like paper, and began advancing on the priests. What happened next is unclear because only one member of that team survived, and he has never spoken coherently about that night. Neighbors heard screaming that lasted for 7 hours. Police eventually broke down the apartment door with power tools. Inside, they found 2 dead priests, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror, and the 3rd priest huddled in a corner, rocking back and forth, covered in blood that was not his own. The possessed woman was dead as well, though whether the exorcism succeeded or the demon simply destroyed its host after finishing with the priests remains unknown. The survivor, Father Dominic, was institutionalized. He draws pictures obsessively, always the same image: a door with a cross on it, surrounded by darkness. Sometimes he whispers that he can still see them in there, his 2 colleagues, trapped in whatever space existed inside that sealed apartment. He says they are still screaming, and the screaming never stops. The 8th rule concerns documentation. Never photograph or record an exorcism without explicit authorization from the cardinal prefect. Visual and audio recordings can become spiritually contaminated, serving as anchors that allow demonic entities to project their influence through the media itself. Anyone who views such recordings risks spiritual contamination, or worse. The Shadow Ministry maintains a restricted archive of authorized recordings, stored in lead-lined vaults deep beneath the Vatican. These recordings are used exclusively for training purposes and can only be viewed in consecrated spaces under the supervision of senior exorcists. Even then, exposure is limited to short segments to minimize psychological impact. Father James Morrison did not understand the danger. During a case in Boston, he secretly recorded the exorcism using a small camera hidden in his equipment bag. His intentions were not malicious. He wanted to study the footage, to analyze his technique, to improve his skills. He uploaded the video to an encrypted personal server for private review. 3 days later, Father Morrison was found dead in his apartment. His eyes had been removed, not cut or torn, but somehow pulled from his skull with such force that the optic nerves were stretched to 3 times their normal length before snapping. His mouth was open impossibly wide, his jaw dislocated. On his computer screen, the unauthorized recording played on an endless loop, but the footage showed something different from what he had recorded. Instead of the exorcism, the video showed Father Morrison himself, sitting in his apartment, methodically removing his own eyes while something dark and shapeless moved in the background. The encrypted server was located and destroyed. Vatican investigators examined the scene and determined that Father Morrison had been compelled by the entity captured in his recording. The demon had used the video as a bridge between the spiritual and physical realms, reaching through the digital medium to seize control of the priest who had dared to document its presence. The 9th and final rule is the one I fear most, the one that haunts my dreams and follows me through every waking moment. Never, under any circumstances, learn the true name of the demon you are facing. If it offers its name willingly, do not listen. Cover your ears, recite prayers, do anything to avoid hearing those syllables. Because once you know a demon's true name, it knows you in return, and it will never stop watching. Names have power in ways most people cannot comprehend. A demon's true name is not merely an identifier, but the very essence of its being condensed into linguistic form. To know that name is to forge an unbreakable connection between yourself and the entity. You become visible to it across any distance, through any barrier, in any moment of weakness. It sees through your eyes, whispers in your thoughts, waits for the perfect moment to claim what that knowledge has cost you. The Church teaches that some information comes with a price too terrible to pay. A demon's true name is exactly that kind of knowledge. It burns itself into your consciousness, cannot be forgotten or unlearned, and marks you permanently as something the entity considers its property. You become tethered to it spiritually, and that tether can be pulled at any time. Father Antonio Viscari learned this truth in the most devastating way possible. He was perhaps the most brilliant exorcist of his generation, fluent in 17 languages, including several dead ones, with an encyclopedic knowledge of demonology that rivaled scholars who had studied for decades. His success rate was extraordinary. He had performed over 60 exorcisms without a single failure. But brilliance can breed arrogance, and Father Viscari became convinced that knowing his enemy more completely would give him greater power over it. During an exorcism in Naples, he did something unthinkable. He demanded that the demon reveal its true name, and he listened when it answered. The name itself cannot be repeated. It exists in a language that predates humanity, composed of sounds that human vocal cords were never meant to produce. The moment Father Viscari heard that name, something changed in his eyes. Those who were present said he became very still, very quiet, and a look of profound horror spread across his face. He completed the exorcism successfully. The possessed woman recovered fully. But Father Vascari was never the same. He began reporting that he could feel the demon watching him constantly, not nearby, but from some infinite distance, its attention fixed upon him like a searchlight that never wavered. He said he could hear it sometimes, not with his ears but in the deepest parts of his mind, whispering his own name back to him in that same ancient tongue. He stopped sleeping. When exhaustion finally forced him into unconsciousness, he would wake up screaming about vast darkness and eyes that saw everything he had ever done, everything he had ever thought. The church tried to help him. Protective blessings, constant supervision, even an attempt to somehow sever the connection through ritual. Nothing worked. The bond forged by that forbidden knowledge could not be broken. Father Vascari deteriorated rapidly. He began speaking in multiple languages simultaneously, his own voice overlapping with others that came from his throat. He would suddenly freeze mid-sentence and stare at nothing, tracking something invisible that moved around him. 6 months after learning that demon's name, Father Vascari disappeared. His room at the Vatican was found empty, the door still locked from the inside. The only trace was a message written on the wall in a substance that analysis could not identify. The message was in that same ancient language, and only one other person at the Vatican could read it. The translation was simple but chilling. "He knows my name, so now he is mine." Search efforts found nothing. Father Vascari had simply vanished as completely as if he had never existed. But 3 weeks after his disappearance, reports began coming from various locations around the world. Different people in different countries reported seeing a priest matching Father Vascari's description, standing motionless in public places, sometimes for hours, always staring directly at churches or other holy sites. When approached, he would turn and walk away, moving in ways that seemed subtly wrong, as if he had forgotten how human locomotion worked. These sightings continue to this day. Father Vascari, or whatever is wearing his form, has been seen in 23 countries. He never speaks, never responds to his name, simply stands and watches before disappearing again. The Shadow Ministry has classified him as a Class 5 spiritual threat. If you see him, you are instructed to avoid contact and report immediately to Vatican authorities. Do not approach him. Do not speak to him. And above all, do not let him speak to you, because the words that come from his mouth are no longer his own. I think about Father Vascari often, especially during the dark hours before dawn when sleep refuses to come. I wonder if any part of him remains, trapped inside whatever he has become, aware but unable to control his own actions. Or perhaps the mercy is that Father Vascari is truly gone, and only the demon remains, puppeting his body through the world as a warning to others who might be tempted to seek forbidden knowledge. These 9 rules are written in blood and trauma, learned through the suffering of those who came before me. Each rule represents someone's death, someone's madness, someone's damnation. They are not suggestions or guidelines. They are the absolute minimum requirements for survival in this work. And even following them perfectly guarantees nothing. I have been doing this for 8 years now. I have performed 43 exorcisms, and I have witnessed things that have carved themselves into my memory so deeply that I know they will be the last images I see before I die. I have heard voices speaking in languages that should not exist, promising things that should not be possible. I have watched human bodies move in ways that defy every law of physics and biology. I have felt the presence of entities so ancient and malevolent that their mere proximity makes reality feel thin, as if the world itself is just a fragile membrane separating us from something vast and hungry that presses against it from the other side. The work has changed me. I see shadows differently now, always alert for movement that does not match the light source. I am suspicious of coincidences, trained to recognize patterns that suggest supernatural influence. I keep blessed salt in every pocket, holy water in a flask on my belt, and I have not had an uninterrupted night of sleep in 6 years. My dreams are compromised territory, places where the things I have faced sometimes return to remind me that I am known to them. But I continue because someone must. The cases keep coming, an endless stream of human suffering inflicted by entities that view our entire species as nothing more than toys to be broken and discarded. Without the shadow ministry, without exorcists willing to stand between the innocent and the demonic, the world would be far darker than anyone realizes. We are the thin black line that holds back an ocean of malevolence, and we pay for that service with pieces of our own humanity. Last week, I received a new assignment. A case in Prague, a young man exhibiting advanced signs of possession. The initial report contained details that troubled me deeply. The possessed individual speaks in multiple voices, demonstrates impossible strength, and seems to know personal information about everyone who enters the room. More concerning, he has been asking for me by name, though we have never met, and he should have no knowledge of my existence. The shadow ministry has assembled a team. I will lead the exorcism, supported by 2 other priests I trust. We have begun the preliminary preparations, gathering the necessary materials, reviewing the rituals, ensuring every detail is addressed properly. We will follow the rules exactly, as we always do, because the rules are all that keep us alive. But I am afraid. Not of the exorcism itself, though that will certainly be harrowing. I am afraid because the possessed man has been repeating something, a message he claims is specifically for me. He says, over and over, in a voice witnesses describe as layered and wrong, "Tell Father Marcus that we remember him. Tell him we have been waiting. Tell him that the woman in Warsaw sends her regards." The woman in Warsaw was my first solo exorcism, 7 years ago. The case was successful. The demon was expelled and the woman recovered. I followed every rule, made no mistakes, and returned home believing I had done good work. But now, 7 years later, something from that case is reaching out to me again, using a possessed man in Prague as its messenger. I do not know what this means. I do not know what has been waiting for me or why. But I will go to Prague because it is my duty. I will perform the exorcism because that is what I was trained to do. And I will follow the rules because they are the only protection I have against forces that would tear me apart simply for the entertainment value of my suffering. If you are watching this, and you have been contacted by someone claiming to represent the shadow ministry, offering recruitment or requesting your assistance, consider very carefully before accepting. This work will consume you. It will take everything you thought you knew about the world and reveal it as a comforting fiction constructed to hide the true horrors that exist just beyond the edge of human perception. But if you are called to this work, if you feel that pull towards service despite the cost, then know that you will never be alone. The shadow ministry is a family forged in darkness, bound together by shared trauma and absolute commitment to protecting the innocent. We stand together, we pray together, and when necessary, we die together, holding the line against an enemy that never sleeps and never forgives. Remember the rules. Trust your training. Keep your faith sharp and your resolve absolute. And if you find yourself face to face with something that should not exist, something that looks at you with ancient hatred and speaks with voices that scrape against your sanity, do not hesitate. Speak the words of the ritual with absolute conviction. Command the entity in the name of all that is holy, and know that somewhere in the darkness, other members of the shadow ministry are doing the same work, fighting the same battles, holding the same line. Tomorrow I leave for Prague. I have said my prayers, checked my equipment, and written letters to be delivered if I do not return. I have done everything I can to prepare. But preparation only goes so far when facing forces that have existed since before humanity crawled out of the caves. The demon, waiting for me, knows my name, remembers me from years ago, and has been patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment to call me back. I do not know if I will survive this assignment. I do not know if the rules will be enough this time. But I know I will go, because that is what we do. We walk into the darkness so others do not have to. We face the demons so the innocent can sleep peacefully, unaware of the war being waged in the shadows for their very souls. If you do not hear from me again, know that I died doing what I believed was right. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you suspect genuine demonic possession, do not investigate alone. Contact the church through proper channels. Request assistance from the shadow ministry. And whatever you do, do not try to communicate with the entity yourself. Because once a demon knows you exist, once it learns your name and sees your face, it will never forget. And in the vast darkness that exists beyond our world, beyond our understanding, there are countless entities waiting for exactly that kind of invitation. The ninth rule exists because some knowledge creates bonds that cannot be broken. Father Vascari learned that truth, and now he walks the earth as something that is no longer entirely human. A warning written in flesh about the price of forbidden knowledge. I pray I am wiser than he was. I pray the rules will be enough. But most of all, I pray that if I fall, if the darkness takes me as it has taken so many others, someone will remember why we do this work. Someone will pick up the burden and continue the fight. Because the demons never stop. They never rest. And they are always waiting for us to make one small mistake. My name is Father Marcus Blackwood. I am a priest in the Vatican's shadow ministry, and this is the work that chose me, even as it slowly destroys me. May God have mercy on us all,